Hello, I'm Jamon Jordan, official historian for the city of Detroit. And this is Black History Month. I want to welcome you to some wonderful programming called Undefeated, a look at Black history in the city of Detroit through the lens of dance, music, architecture, spoken word, and other genres. You can view some wonderful video, which will also be available on Channel 22 and at DetroitArtsandCulture.com. Please enjoy.
History is how we got to where we are. We come through this historical period where institutions are created, where political movements evolve, where neighborhoods and geography is formed. It's these historical moments that help us understand where we are today. So you don't get the Detroit of today without getting through this history. You don't get a Detroit that is surrounded by nearly 200 suburbs that are for decades were predominantly white without going through this history. There's something about Detroit's history that helps us understand why Detroit and the area around Detroit are set up the way they are. Why is it this racial wealth gap that we have? Why is there an issue with housing even right now in the city of Detroit? All of this comes from this long history in the city of Detroit, which begins really, this racial inequality begins when Europeans first arrived in what we now call Detroit on July 24, 1701. So Detroit is one of the most important cities, one of the most important areas in the history of African Americans in the United States. And it is not because it was a racial haven. It's not because it was always a haven for freedom. So that's not the reason why. But there were important institutions that were started by freedom fighters in the city of Detroit. Second Baptist Church is the oldest Black church in the state of Michigan. And it is founded in this history of faith and freedom. So there is no disconnect at that. So there is no Second Baptist Church without the fight against slavery. There is no effective Underground Railroad in the city of Detroit without Second Baptist. These two things go hand in hand. For Black people in the 1800s, faith and freedom are the same thing. Those aren't two separate things. People starting churches are the people helping people escape from slavery. The people helping people escape from slavery believe that this is part of their faith. You have to be a good Christian, and by being a good Christian, that means helping people escape and get freedom. And both of those, faith and freedom, means that they're believing in this fight for education. And so Second Baptist is the first school for Black people in the city of Detroit. So all of this is shaking the landscape of the city of Detroit, a place that at one time had slavery. So Detroit had slavery. And so now you have this freedom institution, this faith institution, this educational institution for Black people, which have been blocked by the forces that existed prior to the establishment of Second Baptist Church. So Second Baptist Church changed that, but even more so, 30 churches come out of Second Baptist Church. So Second Baptist Church's reach is beyond its own church doors. There are 30 other churches in the city of Detroit that come out of Second Baptist Church that have changed Detroit as well. There would be no Hartford Memorial Baptist Church without Second Baptist Church. There would be no Shiloh Baptist Church inside of the Brewsters without Second Baptist Church. Those churches come out of Second Baptist, and then they're children of Second Baptist. I said 30 churches come out of it, but then there's the grandchildren of Second Baptist. There's churches that come from churches that came from Second Baptist. So come on, we wouldn't have no New Bethel Baptist Church with Reverend Clarence LaVaughn Franklin and his daughter, a woman that we all know as the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin. Second Baptist is implicated in all of those things. It is the first major Black religious institution in the state of Michigan, and it is the foundation for creating the Black community in the city of Detroit. But that Black community is going to face the northern version of white supremacy, northern version of Jim Crow. It's not exactly like the South, but they will face these ideas of housing segregation, school inequality, police brutality, job discrimination. So maybe it's not lynching every other day like it is in Mississippi. Maybe it's not, you can't register to vote or the Ku Klux Klan will visit your home, but there's other forms of Jim Crow, other forms of racism that exist besides the racial terrorism that exists in the Jim Crow South. So let's be clear, the Underground Railroad is not underground and it's not a railroad. So these are code words, these are terms used because in the 1800s, the transportation technology is railroads. So if you were talking about traveling from one part of the country to another in the 1800s, what you're talking about is a railroad. You're not talking about an automobile because those don't exist yet. You're not talking about an airplane because that doesn't exist. Had this happened in the 1950s, we probably would be talking about the Underground Highway or the Underground Airlines, because those kinds of transportation technologies existed. But in the 1800s, if you're talking about moving from one part of the country, Mississippi, to another part of the country, Ohio, you're talking about a railroad. And so they're using railroad terminology, and it is applied throughout the Underground Railroad system. So you have people who are hiding people in their homes or in their churches, like the church we're in right now, or in barns, or in hidden rooms, in attics and basements. These are called stations or depots on the Underground Railroad. The person who's doing the hiding is a station master on the Underground Railroad. So they're using railroad terminology. People who are funding this system, giving money to it, and a number of those people were members of Second Baptist Church. The people who are funding this with their funds, because there's no Kresge grant for the Underground Railroad. You can't get a Kellogg Foundation grant for the Underground Railroad. So it has to be funded by people who are invested in freedom fighting. And those people are called stockholders on the Underground Railroad, again, using terms that would go with the railroad industry. And of course, the most dangerous job on the Underground Railroad were the people who took people from one place to another, sometimes taking them all the way from slavery on the plantation to freedom in Detroit, New York, or even Canada. Those people were called conductors on the Underground Railroad. The most famous conductor in America's history is Harriet Tubman. But Harriet Tubman never came to the city of Detroit. Detroit has its own conductors. Many of them were involved with this church, Second Baptist Church. In the Underground Railroad, there were different conductors throughout the system. Let's be clear, the Underground Railroad itself is really organized, led, structured by free black people. One of the myths about the Underground Railroad is that it was a white-led, white savior system of whites saving black people. Black people were the victims of slavery, and white people were coming to their salvation by freeing them and helping them escape from slavery. We have to remove that myth. The founding, the development, the organizing, the leadership of the Underground Railroad are free black people who are working in concert with white allies. So those whites who are part of the Underground Railroad are highly important, and they're heroes. But they're not the founders, they're not the leaders. They're working with, and in some cases, working under the leadership of African Americans. And so what does it look like? It looks mainly like a black person, and of course we know Harriet Tubman, going into areas where people are enslaved, even on actual plantations, and helping them escape from slavery. That's an extreme form of conducting. But the other form of being a conductor on the Underground Railroad is not quite as the more drastic level that Harriet Tubman takes. Another level is people escaping on their own and making it to an area where they can now be assisted by people who are waiting for them to make it to that area so that they can take them to the next stop. Most of the time, they're not taking them all the way from the plantation to Canada. They're taking them from one stop, one station, to the next station. And then some other person will take up the conducting business for the next stop. Or they may have to go on a stretch of the Underground Railroad on their own until they can get to a conductor. So it's not like a real railroad system where you got a ticket, you can go get your ticket, you got routes, everybody is at Grand Central Station and you're just waiting on your train to come in. It's not like that. And many times it's people coming up with their own way of escaping, and finally, as they have done so much on their own, someone joins in to help them make it to the next level. So it's not as fully organized and fully plotted out as sometimes the myths lead us to believe. In 1831, There are two people who escaped from slavery in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky, Thornton and Lucy Blackburn. Her name had been Rutha, but once she gets free, she changes her name to Lucy Blackburn, which is a common practice among black people who escape from slavery, is to get rid of their slave name and take on a new name. Frederick Bailey became Frederick Douglass, Araminta Ross becomes Harriet Tubman, and Isabella Baumfree becomes Sojourner Truth. Well, Rutha Blackburn becomes Lucy Blackburn. They come here to the city of Detroit, and slave catchers, bounty hunters come and capture them along with the sheriff and deputy. A group of black people have a meeting and plan to free Thornton and Lucy Blackburn. One black woman who is a part of that group, Caroline French, goes into the jail cell with Lucy Blackburn to meet her, to visit with her in the jail, which she's allowed to visit. And while in the jail, switches clothes with Lucy Blackburn inside of the jail cell, while the sheriff is not paying attention. And so Lucy Blackburn is able to walk out in the clothes of Caroline French. She makes it over to Canada, being helped by black people here in the city of Detroit. And Caroline French, of course, alerts the sheriff of who she is the next day. And so they have to release her because there's 400 people outside, 400 black folks and a number of white abolitionists along with them who are there to make sure that Caroline is free, but also to free Thornton. This uprising, known as the Blackburn Incident or the Blackburn Riots, occurs on June 17, 1833. And in the course of this, the sheriff is assaulted. He will later die from his injuries. And Thornton Blackburn is also freed and taken over to Canada and reunited with his wife. After this, many of the people who were a part of this uprising begin to really stand up against racism right here in the city of Detroit. About 10 of them are members of First Baptist Church. First Baptist Church is the first and predominantly white Baptist church in the city of Detroit. And it has Jim Crow policies built into the church's practice. Black people have to sit in an area that's built underground. So under the floor is where black people sit. They can't sit in the regular sanctuary with the white members. They cannot hold any office in First Baptist. They can't be deacons, they can't be ushers, of course they can't be ministers. And there is an attendance policy that is applied to African American members, not to white members. And if they miss too many times, they're kicked out of the church. And if they don't pay their tithes at a particular time, they're kicked out of the church. Well, after this uprising that these black people led, 10 of whom were members of First Baptist Church, they're not willing to accept these segregationist policies, these Jim Crow policies at First Baptist Church, and they protest them. They say, hey, First Baptist, you're gonna have to change these rules or you're gonna have a problem. And First Baptist Church says, we're not changing anything. And those members leave First Baptist Church and found Second Baptist Church, the oldest black church in the state of Michigan, and the seventh church period in the city of Detroit. And so this church was founded by people who were already freedom fighters, who had already led an uprising to free Thornton and Lucy Blackburn. And then they stood up against the Jim Crow policy. So they went from fighting against slavery to fighting against Jim Crow segregation. And out of that, they created a church. So freedom fighting is built into the very structure, the very foundation, the very wood paneling that is made Second Baptist Church. This church comes out of struggles against racial inequality. And so that made it, infused it with that spirit from its very beginnings. In the city of Detroit, the most important organization that is involved in the Underground Railroad is the Detroit Vigilant Committee. The Detroit Vigilant Committee is an all-black organization, and it is led by George D. Baptiste, who is a member of Second Baptist Church. William Lambert, who at one time was also a member of Second Baptist Church until he founds the third black church in the city of Detroit, St. Matthew's, and others, William Webb, George Dolerson, and a number of other people who are involved, John Richards. These people, Joseph Ferguson, also a member of Second Baptist Church. These are people who are conductors on the Underground Railroad. They all know all of the sites that you can be hidden in. They know the stations. They know that William Webb's home is a station on the Underground Railroad. Both George D. Baptiste and William Lambert's homes are stations on the Underground Railroad. Seymour Finney's barn, Seymour Finney, a white saloon owner and inn owner has a barn in Capitol Park, and he's hiding black people in that barn. So he's a station master, but the conductor who's bringing people to Finney's barn is George Dolerson, who is the custodian at Capitol Union School, the school right across the street from the Finney barn, the school that used to be the Capitol building for the state of Michigan. State of Michigan's capital was Detroit first and became Lansing in 1847. But during the time that Michigan is a territory and its first 10 years as a state, the Capitol building is in Capitol Park. And it later becomes a school. George Dolerson is a custodian at that school and a member of Second Baptist Church and a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And so once you make it to Detroit, and you probably have had help already with other Underground Railroad leaders from Ohio, from Indiana, from Kentucky, you've already probably had some help from people who have gotten you to Detroit, from Battle Creek, from Ypsilanti. So there's other conductors in this whole network in and around the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan. They've probably helped you get here. And then from here, or from the environs around the city of Detroit, you'll be helped by one of the Detroit conductors who will probably take you over to Canada. But many people escape, stay right here in the city of Detroit, and they don't go all over to Canada. They don't all go to Canada. So Detroit is important because it sits on the international boundary, so that if slave catchers, bounty hunters come, you can cross over until the coast is clear and come back over to where your family lives and where your friends are. The first pastor is William Monroe, who is a major abolitionist, a major anti-slavery activist, and the first teacher for black students in the city of Detroit, because this is where the first school is for black people in the city of Detroit. Of course, the schools are segregated. Black people can't go to Detroit public schools, but they have their own schools, at first in the churches, and this would be the first one. Eventually, the first Detroit public schools will hire black teachers, starting with Fannie Richards, who was also a member of this church. Fannie Richards becomes the first black public school teacher in the city of Detroit and the first black teacher to teach at the integrated school. And she is one of the leaders of the lawsuit to overturn segregation in Detroit public schools in 1869, Workman versus Detroit Board of Education. She's being supported by Second Baptist Church in this lawsuit to overturn segregation in Detroit public schools, 85 years before Brown versus Board of Education. And so Second Baptist Church has this rich history. We will get, of course, later to Supply Chase, who is a white pastor, who is also an abolitionist, also a believer that black people ought to have the full rights that white citizens have, and a proponent of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. He will be the leader of the church at the time of the Civil War and through the period known as Reconstruction. And then after we get past the 19th century and get into the 20th century, in Canada, and comes over to Detroit and becomes the pastor here for 36 years. He's the pastor. He is one of the few people in the city of Detroit who has a street named after him. Not an honorary street name, which we have a lot of those, but there's only 4 street, maybe 5 street names in the city of Detroit named after African Americans: Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Robert Bradby, Prince Hall, and Pelham. Pelham is named after Benjamin Pelham, who was a political leader in Detroit in the 1800s and 1900s. And so outside of them, there are no streets named after them, but Robert Bradby is just that important. One of the founders of the Detroit branch of the NAACP, one of the presidents of the Detroit branch of the NAACP. Again, the person who negotiates with Henry Ford to help bring African Americans to the city of Detroit, one of the supporters of the Dr. Ocean Sweet case, when he is arrested for defending his home against a white mob in 1925. Robert Bradby is spread all over Detroit's black history from the time period when he becomes the pastor in 1910 until his passing away in 1947. And then after him, Reverend A.A. Banks, who will become another civil rights pastor in the city of Detroit, the first black person to join the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, and a friend of the King family. King will speak during A.A. Banks' tenure at Second Baptist Church. He will speak 4 times in this church And he will visit this church as a teenager and then will grow up and speak in this church while Reverend A.A. Banks is the pastor. So this church has this long history in the city of Detroit, whether it's against slavery, whether it's against Jim Crow, whether it's for education, whether it's for promoting civil rights, whether it's against discrimination. It will be in 1843 at this church that the Michigan Colored Convention will occur. And so this is a group of abolitionists and other civil rights leaders meeting here in 1843. They're meeting in Second Baptist Church. It actually wasn't this building because the building it was in was burned down and they moved here after that. But they're meeting at what was then Second Baptist Church to talk about the end of slavery. They're demanding an end to slavery in 1843. They're demanding the right to vote in 1843. They're demanding equal education in 1843. And it will be out of that meeting that members will go and attempt to vote in the 1844 election, and this will go to the Michigan Supreme Court in 1844, and the Michigan Supreme Court would deny black people the right to vote in the state of Michigan. But it is because of the black people who were part of this church, who were part of the institutions and organizations that met at this church, that went and pressed for civil rights, starting in the 1800s, but of course continuing throughout the 20th century.